Every turbine on the grid turned at the same time. One of them started a half-second before the others. Grid C, Unit 19, like it saw it first. I need to say that again because I've told 4 people this story now, and they always get hung up later asking when it started. It started right there. 11:47 p.m., all 64 units, simultaneous rotation away from the prevailing westerly and toward open ocean. The system flagged it as a mass alignment fault. I flagged it as impossible. 30 seconds after the rotation began, the offshore microphones picked up something. I didn't notice it until later when I reviewed the logs. But the timestamp is right there, 11:47 and 31 seconds. A low sound from the east that the system auto-classified as biological. I worked night monitoring at the Avon Buxton Coastal Array, which is a wind farm spread across 9 miles of shoreline on the outer banks of North Carolina, Hatteras Island specifically. If you've driven down Route 12 past Buxton, you've probably seen the turbines. They run along the dune line in clusters of 8, and at night the red aviation lights blink in sequence, so they look like something breathing out there in the dark. I used to think that was kind of beautiful. I don't anymore. My job was simple on paper. I sat in a monitoring station about the size of a double-wide trailer, parked on a gravel pad between Grid C and Grid D. The station had feeds from every turbine, wind speed sensors, tide gauges, a few offshore microphones the marine biology folks had installed to track whale migration, and a radio that connected me to the mainland operations center in Nag's Head. Most nights I watched numbers hold steady, confirmed the auto yaw was keeping the nacelles pointed into the wind, drank too much coffee, and listened to the ocean. The turbines are supposed to follow the wind. That's the whole point. Sensors on top of each nacelle read wind direction and speed, and a yaw motor rotates the housing so the blades face into it. It's automatic. The system corrects itself hundreds of times a night in small increments you'd never notice. When the wind shifts, the turbines shift with it. They chase the wind like sunflowers chase light. That's how they work. That's how they're supposed to work. On October 14th, they stopped doing that. I was eating a sandwich. Turkey and Swiss, if that matters to anyone. I remember because I had it halfway to my mouth when the alignment monitor made a sound I'd never heard before. Not an alarm exactly, more like the system trying to process something so far outside normal parameters that it had to invent a new notification. Every turbine on my display went yellow at once, then red, then back to yellow. The whole screen pulsed like a heartbeat. I set the sandwich down and leaned forward. The wind was coming from the west-southwest at 14 knots, normal for October on Hatteras. But every nacelle on the grid was rotating east, toward the Atlantic, away from the wind. I want to be clear. They weren't drifting or hunting for a new wind direction. They were turning together, all 64, at the same rate of rotation, like someone had given them a single instruction. The yaw angles on my screen moved in lockstep. 91 degrees, 94 degrees, 97 degrees. All of them, every single one, climbing toward due east in perfect unison. I tried to process it rationally. A software glitch maybe, some kind of cascading error in the SCADA network. We'd had a firmware update 2 weeks earlier that caused minor headaches with Grid B's pitch control. So my first thought was that someone had pushed a bad config file and the yaw motors were chasing a phantom wind reading. That made sense. For about 30 seconds it made sense. Then I looked at the blade pitch data and the rational explanation fell apart. The blades were still feathered for westerly wind. The pitch control hadn't changed. Only the yaw had moved. If it were a software error affecting wind calculations, both systems would be off. But the pitch motors were still responding to actual wind data. Only the yaw disagreed. The turbines knew where the wind was coming from. They were choosing to look somewhere else. I radioed Nag's Head. Central, this is Avon Station. I'm showing a full grid yaw anomaly. All units rotating east. Pitch is normal. Wind data is normal. I don't know what I'm looking at. Gareth picked up. He worked the night desk on Mondays, and we'd talked enough times that I recognized his voice before he identified himself. Avon, say again, all units. All 64, same rate. They're passing 100 degrees now and still moving. He was quiet for a few seconds. I could hear him clicking through something on his end. I'm seeing it, Hold on. More clicking. Okay, I'm going to push a system-wide yaw reset from here. Might take a minute to propagate. Copy. I watched the screen. The rotation values kept climbing. 107, 110, 113, all in unison. Whatever Gareth was doing from his end wasn't reaching the turbines. Central, no change. They're still turning. Yeah, I see that. The reset command went through, but they're not responding. Let me try a hard override on grid A and see if that cascades. He tried grid A. Nothing. Grid B, nothing. Grid C through H, nothing. Every override command he sent was received and acknowledged by the system. But the turbines didn't respond. It was like they heard him and just didn't care. They settled at 117 degrees east-southeast, all of them. At 11:53, the rotation stopped and every turbine locked into the same heading. The blades were still spinning because the wind was still blowing, but they were catching it at a wildly inefficient angle. Power output dropped to maybe 12% of capacity. The turbines weren't generating, they were just pointed. Avon, I'm going to call the on-call engineer. Sit tight. Where exactly am I going to go, Gareth? He didn't laugh. I kind of wished he had. I pulled up the offshore weather station data while I waited. Wind was holding steady, no pressure changes, no squall lines, nothing coming from the east that might explain why 64 wind turbines suddenly wanted to stare at it. I checked the tide gauge. Normal tidal cycle. I checked the marine microphones. That's when I noticed the first thing that really got under my skin. The hydrophones were showing elevated low-frequency sound from the east. Not whale calls, not boat engines, not wave noise. It was a continuous tone sitting right around 18 hertz, which is below what human ears can pick up, but well within the monitoring range. Infrasound, the kind of frequency you feel in your chest more than here. And it had started at exactly 11:47. Same minute the turbines moved. I tried to think of what could produce sustained 18 hertz sound offshore. Geological activity maybe, an underwater landslide or some kind of seismic event on the continental shelf. That would explain the infrasound. It wouldn't explain the turbines turning toward it, but at least it was something. Gareth came back on the radio. Avon, engineer says it's probably a SCADA conflict from the firmware patch. He wants to do a rolling reboot of the yaw controllers starting at grid A. It'll take about 40 minutes. He says don't touch anything on your end. Understood. Hey, Gareth, I'm picking up infrasound on the marine array. 18 hertz, continuous from the east. Pause. That's not really our department. I know, but it started at the same time as the yaw event. Another pause. I'll note it, probably unrelated. I let it go, but I didn't believe him, and I don't think he believed himself. The rolling reboot started at 12:15 a.m. Grid A's turbines went offline one by one, cycled through their startup sequence, came back online, and for about 10 seconds each, they pointed west, into the wind, exactly where they should be. Then, one by one, they rotated back to 117 degrees east-southeast. Every single one. It was like watching someone try to turn a cat away from a window. You could move it, but the second you let go, it looked right back where it wanted to look. I didn't say anything on the radio for a while after that. I just sat in the station and watched the numbers. The infrasound was still there, steady as a dial tone. The turbines were all locked east. The wind was blowing west. And I was alone on Hatteras Island in the middle of the night, trying to convince myself this was a software problem. Around 1 a.m. I did something I probably shouldn't have. I opened the maintenance archive. Every monitoring station has access to the local maintenance database. It's mostly work orders, inspection logs, parts inventories, boring stuff. But there's also an incident log where unusual events get recorded, and I'd never had a reason to dig through it before. I searched for yaw anomaly. 14 results. The oldest was from 3 years before I started, dated March 2019. The description was short. Grid D, units 25 to 32, simultaneous eastward yaw deviation. Duration 4 hours. Cause, undetermined. Resolution, spontaneous return to normal operation. The next one was from August 2019, then 2 in 2020, 3 in 2021. The frequency was increasing, and every single incident shared 3 details. The turbines rotated east toward the ocean. The duration was always between 3 and 7 hours, and the cause was always listed as undetermined. But the entry from September 2022 had an additional note I almost missed. Someone had added a comment, flagged as internal only, that read, "Possible correlation with offshore acoustic event. See Morrison memo." I searched for Morrison memo. Nothing came up. Whoever Morrison was, they hadn't filed it in the database, or it had been removed. I went back to the incident logs and noticed something about the dates. They weren't random. I pulled out my phone and opened a calendar. March 2019. August 2019. The gaps between events were getting shorter. Not on any regular schedule, but the trend was obvious. Whatever was causing this was happening more often. And tonight was the first time all 64 turbines had done it simultaneously. But that's not the thing that made my hands go cold. The thing that made my hands go cold was the personnel records attached to 2 of the incident logs. The November 2020 event had a follow-up note. Station monitor C. Weiss did not report for scheduled shift following event. Vehicle found at station. Personal effects recovered. Status, voluntary separation. The March 2022 event had an almost identical note. Station monitor R. Hadley failed to complete shift handoff. Vehicle located at Grid E access road. Status, voluntary separation. Voluntary separation. That's HR language for someone who quits without notice. 2 monitors on 2 different event nights left their cars behind and never came back to work. And someone had coded both of them as voluntary separation, as if they'd just decided to walk off the job in the middle of the Outer Banks at 3 in the morning with no ride. I searched for more personnel flags in the archive. I found one more. Station monitor K. Aldis, August 2021. Did not complete shift. Vehicle recovered from station lot. Radio last used at 3:47 a.m. Status, voluntary separation. 3 people, 3 event nights, 3 cars left behind. All classified the same way. No police reports attached. No follow-up investigations. Just clean, tidy entries that said these people had chosen to leave. I looked at the clock on my screen. It was 1:38 a.m. The timestamp on Aldis's last radio call was 3:47 a.m. I had about 2 hours before I hit whatever window those 3 people had hit. Something else about those timestamps. 2 of the 3 incidents had log entries that repeated. Weiss's event log showed the same sensor reading, identical to the byte, recorded at 2:14 a.m. and again at 2:14 a.m., 7 minutes later. The system clock had either repeated or something had made the same moment happen twice. I don't know what that means. I don't think I want to. I radioed Gareth. "Hey, did you know there are 14 previous yaw anomaly incidents in the maintenance log?" Long pause. "Where are you seeing that?" "Local archive, goes back to 2019. "I don't have access to the local archive from here. I just see the live system." "Well, it's in here. 14 incidents, all eastward rotation, all unresolved, and the frequency is increasing." "Avon, the engineer is handling the SCADA issue. I'd recommend not going too deep into the archive right now. Some of those old logs have bad data from before the system migration." He said it casually, like he was telling me not to bother with a messy closet, but something about his voice changed when he said it. A little too even, a little too rehearsed. I let it go again. but I took photos of every log entry with my phone. By 2 a.m., the engineer had given up on remote fixes. The turbines were still locked at 117 degrees. Power output was garbage. The infrasound was still there, and I was starting to notice something new on the offshore microphones. The 18 Hz tone had shifted. It was at 17 Hz now, then 16. It was dropping slowly, about a hertz every 20 minutes or so. And as it dropped, the turbines adjusted. Not much, half a degree, maybe a degree. But they tracked the frequency change with small yaw corrections like they were following it. I don't know how to explain what that felt like to watch. The turbines were responding to a sound, not wind, not a command from the control system, sound, infrasound coming from somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean, and they were tracking it in real time. I went outside. I know that sounds stupid, and honestly, it was. The protocol for unresolved system anomalies is to stay in the monitoring station, keep the door locked, and wait for an on-site maintenance team. But I needed to see them. I needed to look at the turbines with my own eyes and not through a screen. The Outer Banks at 2 a.m. in October is a specific kind of darkness. There's no light pollution to speak of once you get south of Buxton. The ocean is a black wall of sound to the east. The dunes are low, scrubby shapes, and the turbines are these massive white columns that catch whatever ambient light exists and hold it, so they glow faintly against the sky like bones standing upright. I walked to the edge of the gravel pad and looked up. The nearest turbine was Grid C, Unit 18. Its nacelle was pointed east, out over the ocean, and the blades were turning slowly in the crosswind. The aviation light on top blinked red. On, off, on, off, the same as always. But the blades sounded wrong. Normally a turbine blade in proper headwind makes a steady rhythmic whoosh, a pulse you stop hearing after a few shifts because it's so constant. These blades were catching the wind at the wrong angle, and the sound they made was lower, slower, like each rotation took more effort than it should. A groaning underneath the whoosh that I'd never heard before. Metal stress. The towers themselves were humming, a faint harmonic that I could feel through the gravel under my boots more than hear with my ears. I looked at the windsock on the maintenance pole near the station. It was stretched out west, exactly where the wind data said it should be, pointing directly away from the ocean. But every turbine for 9 miles was pointed at the ocean. The sock and the machines disagreed, and standing there between them, feeling the wind hit the left side of my face while 64 machines stared in the opposite direction, was the first time something in my body, not my mind, told me this was wrong. But I could see the next turbine behind it, and the one behind that, and the one behind that, stretching north and south along the shoreline. And every single one of them was pointed the same direction. The red lights blinked in sequence, like they always did. But now, with every nacelle aimed at the same point offshore, the sequence looked different. It looked like they were all looking at something and blinking at it. I stood there for maybe 2 minutes. The wind was warm for October, which was wrong. October on the Outer Banks should have a bite to it, especially after midnight. But the air coming off the ocean felt like August. Humid, heavy, carrying a smell I couldn't place. Not salt exactly, not fish. Something organic but deeper than that, like the smell of the underside of a rock you pull out of a tidal pool. Old water. Water that hasn't moved in a long time. I breathed it in without thinking and my stomach turned. That's when I noticed the fog. It wasn't moving from the west the way fog usually comes in on Hatteras. It was sitting about a mile offshore, a flat gray band hanging just above the water. I could see it because the turbine lights reflected off it faintly, gave it a reddish tint. It hadn't been there when I'd driven in for my shift at 10 p.m., and it wasn't fog the way fog normally behaves, spreading and drifting and thinning at the edges. This was a wall, clean edges, perfectly horizontal, like someone had drawn a line across the ocean. I went back inside and checked the radar. There was nothing on the marine radar at 1 mile. No fog return, no precipitation, no contacts. Whatever I was seeing out there, the radar didn't agree that it existed. That was the second thing that got under my skin. The first was the infrasound starting at the same time as the turbine event. The second was fog that didn't show on radar. I was collecting things that bothered me, and the collection was growing. Then I saw the light. It was on the exterior camera facing east, the one mounted high on the station's antenna mast. A single point of greenish light, sitting low on the water, maybe a quarter-mile behind the fog bank. It was steady, not blinking, not moving. Just there, like a marker light on a channel buoy, except there are no channel buoys a mile offshore on that stretch of coast. I know the chart. There's nothing out there. I checked the radar again. Nothing. No contact at that bearing. No returns at all beyond the surf line. The light existed on camera and nowhere else. While I watched, it went out. Not faded, just gone. Like someone closed a hand over it. The camera showed nothing but the fog bank and the black water underneath. I sat back in my chair. My mouth was dry. At 2:30 the radio crackled and I nearly came out of my chair. It wasn't Gareth. It was a voice I didn't recognize, thin and flat, with a lot of static behind it. Avon Station, this is offshore relay. Do you copy? We don't have an offshore relay. The monitoring station communicates with Nag's Head and with individual turbine maintenance radios. There's no offshore relay station. There's nothing offshore at all. I picked up the handset. Station calling Avon, identify yourself. I don't have an offshore relay in my directory. Static. Then the voice again, same flat tone. Avon Station, we're showing 64 units at 117 degrees. Can you confirm orientation? It knew the exact yaw angle. I hadn't broadcast that on the open frequency. I'd only told Gareth on the direct line to Central. Station calling Avon, I say again, identify yourself. Confirm orientation Avon, 117 degrees, is that correct? I turned the radio off. I sat there staring at it for a long time. My hands were cold. Not from the temperature, just from whatever was happening in my nervous system. I turned the radio back on but switched to the direct channel to Gareth. Central, did you just relay my yaw data to anyone? Negative, Avon. Who's asking? I got a call on the general frequency from someone identifying as offshore relay. They knew the exact yaw angle. Silence. Then, there's no offshore relay. I know. Don't respond to it again. If it calls back, don't acknowledge it. Why? But Gareth didn't answer that question. He just said, sit tight, Avon. I'm escalating this. I want to describe what the next hour felt like, because I think it matters. Nothing dramatic happened. The turbines stayed locked at 117. The infrasound continued dropping, now sitting around 12 hertz. The fog bank held its position 1 mile out. And I sat in a trailer on a gravel pad on Hatteras Island and slowly became aware that I was afraid. Not panicked, not screaming. Just afraid the way you're afraid when you realize you're in deeper water than you thought, and the current is stronger than it looked from shore. The kind of fear that's mostly just awareness. You understand your situation, and your situation is not good, and there is nowhere to go. The offshore relay voice didn't come back. But at 3:15 I heard something else on the marine microphones. It wasn't infrasound this time. It was in the audible range, between 200 and 400 hertz. And it sounded like breathing. I don't mean that metaphorically. I don't mean it sounded kind of like breathing or it reminded me of breathing. I mean the acoustic pattern was a rhythmic inhalation and exhalation cycle, about 8 seconds in, 12 seconds out, repeating. It was faint. It was coming from the same direction as the infrasound. And it was getting louder. I pulled up the spectrogram and just stared at it. The waveform was clean. Too clean, actually. Natural ocean sounds are messy. Wave noise, biological sounds, sediment movement, all of it creates a chaotic frequency floor. But this signal was sitting on top of all that like it was being generated by something specific, something with lungs or something that functioned like lungs, breathing in the Atlantic Ocean a mile from Hatteras Island. and the turbines were all pointed at it. I started going through the old incident logs again, looking for anything about audio anomalies. I found one entry from November 2021 that mentioned anomalous acoustic signatures on marine array during yaw deviation event. No details, no follow-up, just that one sentence, but attached to it was a file name. Morrison _acoustic _analysis _v2.pdf. The file itself wasn't in the database, just the reference, like someone had linked to it, and then the link target got deleted. Morrison again. I didn't know anyone named Morrison. I'd been at the Avon site for 14 months and never heard the name. At 3:40, something changed. The infrasound, which had been steadily dropping in frequency, hit 7 Hz and stopped, just held there. And at the same moment, every turbine on the grid adjusted its yaw by exactly 2.3 degrees south, all at once, the same synchronized motion as the original event, but smaller. A correction, like whatever they were tracking had moved slightly, and they followed. That was the end of the fixed 117-degree heading. From that point on, the turbines were in active tracking mode, making constant small adjustments, alive almost. That's when I stopped thinking of them as machines. I know how that sounds. I'm an electrical engineer. I've worked with automated systems my entire career. I know what a yaw motor is. I know what a feedback loop looks like. But what I was watching wasn't a feedback loop. A feedback loop responds to input from its own sensors. These turbines were responding to something external that wasn't in their programming. They had no acoustic sensors. They had no way to detect infrasound. And yet they were tracking it. Unless they weren't detecting the sound. Unless they were detecting whatever was making the sound through some mechanism I didn't understand. I need to tell you about the rules now, because I think the rules are why I'm alive. Every monitoring station has a laminated card zip-tied to the desk. It's supposed to contain emergency procedures, contact numbers, that sort of thing. Mine had all of that, plus a handwritten list on the back that someone had added with a Sharpie. The handwriting was cramped, and the ink was faded enough that it had been there for a while. I'd noticed it my first week but never really read it because it looked like someone's personal notes. That night, at 3:45 a.m., I flipped the card over and read it. It said, "If all grids face offshore, do not leave the station. If offshore sound is detected below 10 Hz, close the window vents. Do not respond to any radio traffic after 3 a.m. that does not originate from Central. If the tide gauge shows rising water that contradicts the predicted tide table, move station supplies to the upper shelf. If the fog reaches the dune line, turn off all interior lights. Do not look directly at the turbine bases after midnight during an eastward event." The window vents were open. I closed them. I checked the tide gauge on my screen. The predicted tide for 3:45 a.m. was 1.2 feet. The actual reading was 1.9 feet and rising. The tide was coming in when it should have been going out. I moved everything I could reach to the upper shelves: laptop bag, first aid kit, the binder of paper procedures, my lunch cooler. I did it quickly and without thinking too hard about why. The fog. I looked at the exterior camera feeds. The fog bank was still offshore, but it was closer, maybe half a mile now, and it was moving slowly toward the beach. I left the lights on. I don't know if I was being brave or just didn't want to sit in the dark. Probably the second one. The last instruction on the list bothered me the most. Don't look at the turbine bases. Why? What was at the base of the turbines? I'd walked past them hundreds of times during daylight inspections. They were concrete foundations with access doors for the internal ladder and electrical connections. Nothing unusual about them. But whoever wrote those rules had put it last, like it was the most important one, or the one they most wanted you to remember. I did not go outside to look at the turbine bases. I want that on the record. At 4:10, the breathing sound on the marine microphones got loud enough that I could hear it through the station walls. Not through the speakers, through the walls. The station was partially soundproofed because turbine noise is constant, and you'd go crazy without some dampening. But this came through anyway. A long, low inhalation that lasted maybe 8 seconds, like air being pulled through a pipe the size of a subway tunnel. Silence. A longer exhalation that seemed to push against the walls, make them flex outward slightly, though I might have imagined that. The rhythm was slow enough that you could forget it was happening between breaths, and then it came back, and your body remembered before your mind did. My ribs tightened with each inhalation, like something was pulling the air out of the room. I noticed the coffee in my cup was vibrating. The surface trembled with each breath cycle, tiny concentric rings spreading from the center. I stared at that for a while. The cup was sitting on the desk, and the desk was bolted to the floor, and the floor was a steel frame trailer sitting on concrete blocks, and the concrete was sitting on the ground, and the ground went down to the water table, and the water table connected to the ocean, and something in the ocean was breathing, and I could watch it breathe in my coffee. I turned the marine microphone speakers off because hearing it twice, once through the walls and once through the speakers, was making my hands shake. I turned them off, and I sat in the quiet and listened to whatever was breathing out in the ocean breathe through the walls of my station. The turbines made another synchronized correction at 4:22. This time 1.7 degrees north. They were tracking something that was moving. Slowly, along the coast, roughly north. And they followed it the way radar dishes follow aircraft, smooth, continuous, locked on. At 4:25, I noticed the radio was making noise even though it was set to the Nag's Head direct channel and nobody was transmitting. A soft hiss, rhythmic, rising and falling. I listened to it for a minute before I understood. The static was breathing. The same 8-second in, 12-second out pattern as the hydrophone signal. The radio was picking it up. Or something was pushing it through the radio frequency. The static inhaled when the walls inhaled. Everything in the station was synchronized to whatever was out in that water. I also started hearing the towers, not through the microphones, through the air. A low metallic groan that came and went, like a ship hull flexing in a swell, except it was coming from the turbine towers themselves. The steel was vibrating at the infrasound frequency and translating it into an audible harmonic, the way a tuning fork picks up a frequency from another tuning fork across a room. 64 steel towers, 300 feet tall, groaning together in the dark. I pulled up the Nag's Head direct line. Central, you still there? I'm here, Avon. Gareth, who's Morrison? Long pause. I could hear him shift in his chair. Where'd you hear that name? It's in the incident logs, multiple references to a Morrison memo and a Morrison acoustic analysis. Files are missing from the database. I don't know anyone named Morrison. Gareth. I've been on this desk for 2 years and I've never worked with anyone named Morrison. It might be someone from before my time. Drop it for now. What about Weiss, Hadley, Aldis? The silence was longer this time. I could hear Gareth breathing. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, smaller. Where did you find those names? Personnel flags in the incident archive. 3 station monitors who didn't finish their shifts during eastward events. Cars left behind, all coded as voluntary separation. Stop reading the archive, Avon. What happened to them? Stop reading the archive. The rules on the back of the station card. Who wrote those? What rules? Handwritten on the back of the emergency procedure card. Instructions for what to do during an eastward event. Dead silence. Not the kind where someone's thinking, the kind where someone is deciding what to tell you. Avon, listen to me. Follow whatever's on that card. I'm serious. I don't care how it got there or who wrote it. If there are instructions, follow them. You've seen this before. I've heard about it. I haven't seen it. Not like this, not all 64. The ones before were always partial, a grid or two. This is the first time it's been the whole array. What does that mean? I don't know. I've made calls. Someone from the engineering team is driving down from Norfolk, but they won't be there until dawn. Just stay inside, keep the door locked, and follow the card. He hung up, not signed off, hung up. The line just went dead. Between 4:30 and 5 a.m., I'm going to be honest, I lost some time. I don't mean I blacked out. I mean I sat in the chair and watched the screens, and at some point I looked at the clock, and 30 minutes had passed, and I couldn't account for them. I don't know if I fell asleep or just went somewhere inside my own head. The numbers were still there, still wrong. The turbines were still locked east. The tide was still rising against the predictions. The breathing was still coming through the walls. But something had changed while I wasn't paying attention. The fog had reached the dune line. I saw it on the exterior cameras, a solid gray wall sitting right at the edge of the beach, exactly where the sand met the dune grass. It hadn't rolled in the way fog rolls. It had advanced like a front, like something pushing it forward from behind, and now it was sitting there, 50 yards from my station, completely still. The card said to turn off the interior lights. I didn't want to. Every part of me wanted to keep the lights on and pretend that the fluorescent buzz overhead was some kind of protection. But whoever wrote those rules had been right about the vents and the tide and the radio. So I got up, and I flipped the breaker for the overhead lights and sat back down in the glow of the monitor screens. In the dark, the station felt different, smaller. The hum of the computer fans was louder. The sound of the wind outside and the other sound, the breathing, seemed closer. And through the window I could see the fog sitting on the dune line, faintly illuminated by the blinking red lights of the turbines. Something else I noticed in the dark. The monitors were showing data I hadn't called up. A screen on the far right that I normally used for weather radar was displaying a topographic map of the ocean floor offshore. I hadn't opened that application. The map showed the continental shelf sloping away from Hatteras, the shallow water dropping off into the deep channel Morrison had mentioned. And on the map, there was a marker, a single point, blinking at the same rate as the turbine lights, sitting in the channel at a depth of about 200 meters. It hadn't been there before. No one had placed it. The system had generated it on its own, and it was moving west, toward shore, toward me. I closed the application. When I reopened it 10 seconds later, the marker was gone. I don't know if the system was trying to show me something or if I was hallucinating. I don't know which option is worse. The red lights were still blinking in sequence, but the sequence had changed. Before, the aviation lights cycled north to south, a standard FAA pattern for obstacle lighting. Now they were blinking in pairs, 2 on, 2 off, 2 on, 2 off, and the pairs were the turbines on either side of the same east-facing heading, so the blink pattern moved along the coast like eyes opening and closing. I'm using that word deliberately, eyes, because that's what it looked like, and I think that's what it was supposed to look like, and I think whoever designed that blink pattern did it on purpose. I pulled up the aviation light control system. The lights were running on their own timing circuit, independent of the SCADA network. I had no ability to change the pattern from my station. But the pattern had changed anyway. The breathing stopped at 5:08. Just stopped. Between one exhalation and the next inhalation, it ceased. The marine microphones showed the infrasound still present, now holding steady at 7 hertz, but the rhythmic breathing pattern was gone. The silence was worse than the sound. The sound at least had a rhythm you could track, a pattern you could anticipate. The silence was just waiting. Then every turbine on the grid began rotating again, slowly, less than a degree per minute, but they were all moving south, tracking along the coastline, and the rate was accelerating. Whatever they were following was moving faster now. At 5:14, my exterior door unlocked. I heard the click, The electromagnetic lock on the station door is controlled by my keycard reader inside and a remote system in Nag's head. I hadn't touched my card. I called Gareth. No answer. I called again. Nothing. The line to Central was dead. Not busy, not ringing, dead. Like the circuit had been cut. I got up and manually engaged the deadbolt. It's a physical lock, no electronics. It turned with a solid thunk. I went back to my chair and sat down. On the cameras, the fog was moving. Not toward the station, along the dune line, south, the same direction the turbines were tracking. It moved with purpose, at roughly walking speed, and it maintained that impossible clean edge, a gray wall sliding along the coast like a curtain being pulled. I watched it pass the station on the cameras. The wall of fog moved south along the dune line at a steady walking pace, maybe 3 miles per hour, and as it went, it swallowed everything. Dune grass, beach access signs, the portable toilets near the public parking lot. Everything behind the fog disappeared, and everything ahead of it was still clear and normal, lit by the red pulse of the turbine lights. The boundary between the two was sharp enough to cut paper. The temperature reading on the exterior sensor dropped 9 degrees in 4 seconds as the fog crossed it. Then, after the fog passed, the temperature came back. 9 degrees in another 4 seconds. Whatever that fog was made of, it was cold. Deep ocean cold. The kind of cold that doesn't belong at sea level on the Carolina coast. As it moved south toward Grid D and Grid E, I noticed something about the dune grass in the fog's wake. On the camera it was hard to tell, but the grass looked flattened. Not blown down by wind. Pressed down. Like something heavy had passed over it. The fog didn't weigh anything. Fog is water vapor. It doesn't press grass flat. But something inside it, or behind it, or underneath it, had weight. And as it passed each turbine, the blinking light on top went dark. Not off, dark. The lights didn't switch off in sequence the way they would during a controlled shutdown. They went dark the way a candle goes dark when someone walks in front of it. Eclipsed. And then, after the fog passed, they came back on. But the blink pattern was different when they returned. Faster. Like something had woken them up. I'm going to tell you about the shadow now, and I need you to understand that I am a rational person, and I have a degree in electrical engineering, and I don't believe in things unless I can measure them. I need you to understand all of that before I tell you what I saw on the camera feed from the base of Grid D, Unit 28. At 5:21, as the fog was passing that turbine, the base-mounted security camera showed the concrete foundation of the tower in infrared. The tower is 15 feet in diameter. The concrete pad extends another 10 feet in every direction. There was nothing near the base, no animals, no people, no debris. Just sand and concrete and the tower. And then, on the north side of the tower, something cast a shadow. The camera was infrared. There was no visible light source to create a shadow. Infrared cameras detect heat radiation, not reflected light. You can't cast a shadow on an infrared camera unless you're blocking the thermal radiation coming from the surface behind you. Which means something was standing between the camera and the concrete pad. Something cold enough to block the pad's thermal signature. The shadow was tall, taller than the camera's field of view. I could see the base of it, roughly oval, maybe 6 feet across, and it extended upward past the frame. It wasn't human-shaped. It wasn't any shape I can give a name to. It was just there, cold and tall and standing at the base of the turbine while the fog passed. And then the fog cleared, and the shadow was gone. I didn't look at any more base cameras after that. I followed the rule. By 5:30, the turbines had tracked nearly 15 degrees south. The fog had moved past my station and was continuing down the coast. The infrasound was still holding at 7 hertz. The tide had risen to 3.1 feet, almost 2 feet above prediction, and I could hear water in places water shouldn't be, a gentle lapping somewhere behind the station where the parking area slopes toward a drainage ditch. I want to tell you something about how fear works over a long period of time, because I think people imagine it wrong. They think it's a spike, an adrenaline rush, a moment of terror. And it can be that. But when it goes on for hours, it changes into something else. It becomes a physical state, like being cold or being exhausted. Your body adjusts to it. Your heart rate comes down from the initial spike but doesn't return to normal. Your muscles stay tight, but the shaking stops. Your mind keeps processing information, but there's a layer of cotton between you and everything you're seeing, like your brain has put up a filter to keep you functional. You're afraid, but you're working inside the fear, using it as a lens instead of being blinded by it. That's where I was at 5:30, working inside it. I almost called my brother. He lives in Charlotte. He wouldn't have understood a word of what I was going through, but I just didn't want to be the only person awake who knew something was wrong. I picked up my phone and got as far as opening his contact before I put it down. What was I going to say? Hey, the turbines are looking at something and I think the ocean is getting closer. He'd tell me to go to sleep. At 5:38, the radio came back. Not the Nag's Head direct line, the general frequency, and it wasn't the offshore relay voice, it was Gareth. Avon, you copy? Copy Central. What happened to the direct line? Went down about 20 minutes ago. We're on the backup frequency. Listen, I got through to the Norfolk team. They have something they want me to tell you. Go ahead. They found the Morrison files. I didn't say anything, I just waited. Morrison was a marine acoustics researcher who worked with the array in 2018, before the turbines were even fully operational. She was studying infrasound propagation along the continental shelf, and she used the turbine sensor network as a measurement grid. She published an internal report in January 2019, right before the first yaw anomaly event. What did the report say? She found a recurring infrasound source approximately 4 miles offshore, in the deep channel between the continental shelf and the slope. The source was biological. Biological. Her words. She classified it as biological based on the waveform characteristics: rhythmic, variable amplitude, consistent frequency range. She compared it to cetacean calls but said the frequency was too low and the duration was too long. She said, and I'm reading this directly, "The source exhibits behavioral characteristics inconsistent with any cataloged marine species. The signal duration, spanning 40+ hours with no interruption, suggests a stationary organism of considerable mass." A stationary organism. Yeah. 4 miles offshore. In 2018, she estimated it was moving closer based on signal strength trends. Her last measurement put it at 2.7 miles. And now I'm picking it up at 1 mile. Gareth didn't respond right away. The Norfolk team wants you to check something. They want you to look at the turbine vibration sensors, not the nacelle ones, the tower ones. The accelerometers mounted at the base of each tower. I pulled up the base vibration monitoring system. It's designed to detect structural issues, ground settling, that sort of thing. Each tower has 3 accelerometers at its foundation. I'd never paid much attention to them because they almost never flagged anything. 61 of the 64 towers were showing micro vibrations outside normal parameters. Not structural vibration from wind load, something else. A rhythmic pulse at the base of each tower, traveling up from the ground. 7 hertz. The same frequency as the infrasound in the water. The sound was in the ground. Whatever was generating it offshore, the vibration was propagating through the seabed and up through the concrete foundations and into the towers. The turbines weren't detecting the sound through the air. They were feeling it through their feet. Central, I'm seeing it. 7 hertz in the base accelerometers, 61 of 64 units. Which 3 are clean? I checked. Grid H units 57, 58, 59, the 3 southernmost. Those are the ones farthest from the deep channel. Gareth, what is this thing? He didn't answer that. Instead, Morrison's report had a second section that the Norfolk team just found. It was filed separately, classified as speculative, and locked under a different access level. It contains a series of recommendations. Recommendations for what? for what to do when the source gets close enough to affect the array. That's the handwritten rules. Some of them. Morrison's list is longer. What else is on it? He read me 3 more rules. I wrote them down on the back of a clipboard because the laminated card didn't have them. If the turbines begin tracking southward, the source is moving toward the inlet. Do not attempt to intercept its path. If the base vibration exceeds 12 Hz, the source is ascending the shelf slope. Evacuate the station toward the mainland within 15 minutes. If the turbines stop moving and the blades stop spinning simultaneously, do not wait. Leave. Do not stop until you have crossed the bridge to the mainland. Gareth, why weren't these rules in the station? I don't know. I just found out they existed 20 minutes ago. The Norfolk team thinks Morrison gave a short version to the station monitors and kept the rest classified because she didn't want to cause a panic. Morrison, is she still with the company? No, she left in 2019. The Norfolk team doesn't have a forwarding contact. She left right after the first yaw anomaly event. I didn't say that out loud, but we both knew the timing. What about the previous incidents? The 14 yaw anomalies in the log? The Norfolk team is reviewing them now. They think the source has been approaching the coastline gradually over the past 6 years. Each yaw event corresponds to a closer approach. The partial events, 1 or 2 grids, were when it was farther out, and only the nearest turbines could detect it through the ground vibration. And tonight it's close enough for all 64. Yes. And it's moving south toward the inlet. Based on the turbine tracking, yes. Hatteras Inlet. The gap between Hatteras Island and Ocracoke Island. Deep water close to shore. One of the main channels where the Atlantic meets Pamlico Sound. If something very large was moving along the coast and wanted to come inshore, Hatteras Inlet would be where it would go. Central, base vibration on grid D is at 9 Hz. It's climbing. Copy. Monitor it. If it hits 12, you need to get in your truck and drive north. Don't stop at the station in Buxton. Don't stop until you're across Bonner Bridge. That's 45 minutes of driving. I know. In the middle of the night. I know. On a 2-lane road with no shoulder and the ocean on both sides. Avon, I know. Just watch the number. At 5:52, the ocean stopped. I don't mean the waves stopped. I mean the sound stopped. Every ambient noise from outside, the wind, the surf, the groaning of the towers, all of it cut out at once, like someone had pressed mute on the entire coastline. For about 5 seconds, I sat in total silence. The only sound was the computer fans and my own breathing and the blood in my ears. Then it came back, all of it, rushing in like a wave, and the turbines stopped tracking south and began a new rotation. This time they turned northeast. All 64 simultaneous, same rate. The thing had changed direction. It wasn't heading for the inlet anymore. It was heading north, toward Buxton, toward the station. No, not toward the station, toward shore. Whatever it was, it had been moving parallel to the coastline, and now it was turning toward the beach. I checked the tide gauge, 4.2 feet, more than 3 feet above the predicted level. Water was audibly running somewhere outside the station. The parking lot was flooding. The base vibration hit 10 Hz on the nearest towers. The fog had reversed direction. On the cameras, I could see it pulling back from the south and consolidating in the east, directly offshore from my position. It was thicker now, and taller. What had been a band of gray maybe 30 feet high was now a wall stretching up beyond the camera frame. I couldn't see the ocean behind it. I couldn't see the sky above it. 11 Hz. I put on my jacket. I picked up my keys. I left my sandwich on the desk, my coffee cup, the clipboard with Morrison's rules. I kept my phone and the laminated card. 11.4 Hz. I went to the door. The deadbolt was still engaged. I turned it. The electromagnetic lock was still released, same as when it had clicked open on its own an hour earlier. I put my hand on the handle. 11.7 Hz. Through the door, I could feel it, not hear it, feel it. A vibration in the metal handle and traveling up from the ground through the station's foundation and into every surface I was touching. My teeth buzzed. The fillings in my molars ached. 7 Hertz, the frequency Morrison's report described, was below hearing but above feeling, and my body was a receiver. 11.9. I opened the door. The parking lot was under 3 inches of water. My truck was 50 feet away. The turbines were all pointed at a spot in the ocean maybe half a mile offshore, and their blades were barely turning, the wind fighting against the wrong angle, and the red lights on top were blinking in that paired pattern. Open, close, and the fog was a wall across the eastern sky so tall I couldn't find the top of it. I ran. The nearest turbine blade passed overhead as I crossed the gravel pad, and the sound it made was nothing I'd heard before. Not a whoosh, a moan, low and long and descending in pitch, like a whale call played through a pipe organ. The blade was barely turning, but the sound filled the air above me, and the second blade did the same thing, and the third, and I could hear the same sound coming from every turbine up and down the coast, all of them moaning together like they were trying to say something in a language I was grateful I couldn't understand. My boots splashed through the water, and the gravel underneath shifted, and I almost fell, but I didn't. I got to the truck, I got the door open, I got inside, I turned the key. The engine caught. I threw it in reverse, swung around, hit the access road, hit Route 12 northbound. Behind me, in the rearview mirror, I could see the turbine lights. All of them, the entire array, every blinking red eye along 9 miles of coastline. As I drove, the lights in the mirror turned. I watched them track in the glass. They were following something, tracking something that was between me and the station I'd just left. I drove north. I didn't stop in Buxton. I went through Frisco, through Avon, through Salvo, through Waves, through Rodantha. I drove the length of Hatteras Island at 3 in the morning with the ocean on my right and Pamlico Sound on my left, and nothing but 2 lanes of asphalt between them, and I crossed Bonner Bridge at 6:25 a.m. as the first gray light of dawn was leaking into the sky behind me. Route 12 at night is one of the loneliest stretches of road in America. There are places where the pavement is barely wider than your truck, and the sand drifts across the lanes, and you can see water on both sides, Atlantic and Sound, and there's nothing between you and either one except a few feet of low dune and beach grass. Every few miles you pass through a cluster of vacation rentals, dark and empty in the off-season, and then it's just road and sand and sky again. That night the road felt different. The water was higher on both sides than I'd ever seen it. In some places it was lapping at the shoulder. My headlights caught the shine of it, black and flat, and I kept my speed up because I had this sick certainty that if I stopped, the water would keep rising and the road would disappear and I'd be sitting in my truck in the middle of a new ocean with nowhere to go. About halfway up the island, near Salvo, I passed one of the small fishing marinas that dot the Sound side. There's a dock with a few boats and a bait shack and a couple of security lights. As I drove past, the security lights were pointing east, both of them. They're supposed to illuminate the parking lot and the dock, which is to the west. But both light fixtures were rotated on their mounts, aimed at the Atlantic side of the island, throwing their light into empty dune grass. I didn't stop. I kept driving. I pulled over on the other side. Bodie Island. I stopped the truck and I sat there and I breathed and I watched the sun come up. The ocean was quiet. That's what I remember most about that sunrise. After hours of breathing sounds and infrasound and turbine hum, the ocean was just the ocean again. Waves on sand, gulls, normal morning sounds. The silence where the other noise had been felt like a held breath, like the world was pretending the night hadn't happened. I sat there with the engine off and the windows down and I cried a little. Not a lot. Just enough that my throat hurt. I was tired and I was scared and I was alone, and the sunrise was so normal that it made everything I'd just experienced feel like insanity. Maybe it was insanity. Maybe I'd had some kind of breakdown in that trailer and imagined all of it. That would have been the better option. Then the quiet broke. At 6:41, my phone rang. Unknown number. This is Avon Station Monitor. Who's calling? This is Laura Morrison. I didn't know what to say. I just waited. I was told to contact you. The Norfolk engineering team has my number for emergencies. They used it for the first time tonight. Dr. Morrison, your report, the infrasound source. You need to listen to me, and you need to remember this because I'm only going to say it once and then I'm hanging up and changing my number. Are you listening? Yes. The turbines aren't malfunctioning. They never were. The yaw response is built into the original engineering specifications, buried in a firmware layer that the standard maintenance team doesn't have access to. The turbines were designed to detect seismic infrasound through their foundations and orient toward the source. That capability was included before the first tower was erected. By who? The line crackled. Not normal cell static. A low warble like the signal was being compressed by something. It lasted 3 seconds. Then her voice came back, mid-sentence. Funded the array. The Avon Buxton facility wasn't built to generate power. Say that again. The power generation is real. The grid connection is real. The electricity is real. But it's a secondary function. She paused. I heard something on her end. A dull tone, far away, that she seemed to be listening to. When she spoke again, her voice was flatter, more controlled. The primary function of 64 coastal wind turbines with 15-foot diameter concrete foundations sunk into the seabed is to serve as a detection and monitoring grid for deep ocean infrasound sources approaching the continental shelf. While she was talking, I noticed something through my windshield. The antenna on a radio tower across the road, maybe half a mile away, was rotating, slowly, eastward. I watched it turn while Morrison told me what the turbines were. Monitoring, not generating. Monitoring. The turbines are sensors. The yaw behavior is a directional indicator. When they all face the same heading, they're telling you where the source is. When they track, they're telling you it's moving. Her voice dropped. I almost lost the next part. When they stop and the blades stop, they're telling you it's arrived. What is it? The line went dead. I stared at the phone for 10 seconds. 15. Then it rang again. Same number. Sorry, the call dropped. She didn't sound like someone whose call had dropped. She sounded like someone who had stopped talking because she'd heard the same thing I'd been hearing all night. Where was I? You were going to tell me what it is. No, I was going to tell you what I know, which isn't the same thing. She took a breath. I spent 14 months trying to answer that question. I left because I couldn't, and because the closer it got, the less I wanted to know. She paused again. The warble came back on the line, fainter this time. It's biological. It's large, larger than anything in the catalogs. It lives in the deep water off the shelf slope in the North Atlantic, and it follows a cyclical approach pattern that brings it closer to shore approximately every 8 to 12 months. Each approach gets closer than the last. How close? The first time I detected it, it was 6 miles out. Tonight it was less than 1. And the fog? I don't know what the fog is. I don't know if it's a byproduct of the organism or something else entirely. I know it appears during approach events, and I know it doesn't show on radar, and I know you shouldn't be near it. The shadow at the turbine base. She was quiet for a long time. You saw that? On infrared. I saw it once, on a handheld thermal camera during the second event. I put it in the report, and then I deleted it. What I deleted is the reason I left. What was it? The source isn't just in the ocean. The infrasound propagation through the seabed creates, I don't know what to call them, extensions, pressure shadows, areas where the ground vibration concentrates and interacts with the surface. They form around the turbine foundations because the concrete acts as a waveguide. They look like shadows on thermal imaging because they're cold spots. Ground-level thermal voids in the shape of something standing upright. In the shape of something standing upright. That's all I'm going to say about that. Dr. Morrison, the turbines tonight, they were all tracking something that was heading toward shore. If this thing is on an approach cycle and each cycle gets closer, what happens when it reaches the beach? The turbines will stop turning, all of them. The blades, the nacelles, everything. They'll lock in place and go completely still. That's the final indicator. Final indicator of what? That it's no longer offshore. She hung up. I sat in my truck on Bodie Island and watched the sunrise finish. It was a clear morning. The wind was coming from the west, normal for October. Across the sound I could see Hatteras Island, a thin, dark line on the horizon. I pulled up the remote monitoring app on my phone. I still had access to the array's basic telemetry. The turbines were all showing normal yaw orientation, westward into the wind, blades spinning at rated speed, power output nominal, like nothing had happened. The infrasound reading on the marine microphones was 0. The tide gauge was back to predicted levels. The bass vibration was within normal parameters. Everything was fine. Everything looked exactly the way it was supposed to look. I drove to Nag's Head. I went to the operations center. Gareth was still at the desk, looking like he hadn't slept, which made 2 of us. He didn't ask me what happened. He already knew. He handed me a cup of coffee and told me I was on paid leave for 3 days and that a review team would be in touch. There was a whiteboard behind his desk that normally showed the daily maintenance schedule. Someone had erased it and written a single line in red marker. All units nominal. No incident report required. I stared at that for a while. No incident report. 64 turbines had defied their programming for 7 hours. The tide had risen 3 feet above prediction. Something had been breathing in the Atlantic close enough to hear through walls, and no incident report was required. Gareth, who wrote that? He didn't turn around. It was there when I came back from the bathroom. I don't know. You work alone on the night desk. He didn't say anything. He just drank his coffee and looked at his screens, and I understood that the conversation about October 14th was over. Not just between us, everywhere, for everyone. It was over, and it had never happened, and the whiteboard said so. The review team never called. I went back to work the following Monday. Someone had replaced the laminated card at my station. The new one didn't have anything written on the back. The incident logs I'd photographed on my phone were gone, not the photos, the entries in the database. I checked. Every yaw anomaly record from 2019 through 2023 had been deleted. The personnel records for Weiss, Hadley, and Aldis were gone too. The database showed clean, unbroken operational history, like those events had never happened and those people had never existed. I asked Gareth about it on Tuesday. He said he didn't know what I was talking about. He said it with the same flat voice he'd used on the radio when he told me not to dig into the archive. But his hands were shaking when he poured his coffee. I worked 3 more shifts before I quit. Nothing happened during those shifts. Normal wind, normal yaw behavior, normal power output, normal everything. But I couldn't stop watching the turbine heading readings, and I couldn't stop checking the marine microphone data for low-frequency anomalies. And every time the wind shifted and the nacelles rotated, I held my breath until I confirmed they were following the wind and not something else. On my last night, I was doing a final check of the system before handing off to my replacement when I noticed something in the bass vibration data that I'd overlooked before. The 3 southernmost turbines, Grid H units 57, 58, and 59, the ones that had been cleaned during the event, the ones Morrison said were farthest from the deep channel, those 3 units were now showing micro-vibrations at 4 Hz, below the alarm threshold, below the notification level. But present. They hadn't been doing that before October 14th. I went back through the archived data to confirm. Before the event, those 3 units had perfectly clean vibration profiles. After the event, 4 Hz, continuous. The source was closer now, even during its resting state, close enough that even the farthest turbines could feel it. I handed off to my replacement. Her name was Dana. She was 26, fresh out of a technical program in Greenville, and she was excited about the job. She told me she'd always wanted to work with wind energy. She said the turbines were beautiful at night, the way the lights blinked in sequence. She said it looked like they were communicating. I almost told her everything. I had the words lined up in my head. I was going to start with the laminated card and work forward, but she was smiling, and she was holding her new key card like it meant something to her. And I thought about Morrison picking up the phone and giving me one piece of information, and then disappearing. I thought about how that information sat in my chest like a stone for weeks afterward. I thought about whether knowing had made me safer or just more afraid. I didn't tell her. I shook her hand and I showed her where the coffee maker was, and I walked out of the station, and I didn't look back at the turbines. I could feel them behind me. I could feel which direction they were facing without looking, the way you can feel someone watching you from across a room. They were facing west, into the wind, doing their job. But the 3 southernmost towers were humming at 4 Hz in their foundations, and no one was going to tell Dana about that. And I was going to drive away and leave her there. I moved to Raleigh 3 weeks later. It's about 3.5 hours from the coast, inland, up in the Piedmont. I got a job at a solar installation company. No moving parts, no yaw motors, no foundation sunk into the ground. Just panels sitting in the sun, quiet and still and pointed at the sky. For the first couple weeks I thought I was going to be fine. New city, new job, no ocean. I slept with the windows closed even though my apartment got stuffy because I didn't want to hear wind anymore. I stopped checking the Avon telemetry app on my phone. I deleted Gareth's number. I tried to convince myself that whatever happened on October 14th was an anomaly within an anomaly, a one-time convergence of circumstances that wouldn't repeat. My girlfriend asked me once why I wouldn't go to Wrightsville Beach with her that weekend. I told her I was tired. The truth is, I couldn't look at the ocean anymore without listening for something underneath the waves. She stopped asking after a while. Then small things started catching my attention. A weather vane on a church steeple in downtown Raleigh that pointed east when the flags on the building next to it were blowing west. Satellite dishes on apartment buildings that seemed tilted a few degrees off their normal alignment, all in the same direction. A compass app on my phone that jittered when I held it near the ground. Probably nothing. Probably the kind of thing you only notice when you're looking for it. I told myself that. I almost believed it. Last Tuesday I was eating dinner in my apartment, and I felt something in the floor. A vibration. Low, barely there. The kind of thing you'd write off as a truck passing or a washing machine running somewhere in the building. But it was rhythmic, and it was constant. And when I put my hand flat on the floor, I could feel it pulsing at a frequency that made my fillings ache. I got in my car and drove to the hardware store and bought a cheap vibration meter. The kind contractors use to check if a foundation is settling. I put it on my apartment floor and turned it on. 7 Hz. I live on the 3rd floor. There is no mechanical explanation for a 7 Hz vibration on the 3rd floor of a residential building in Raleigh, North Carolina, 200 miles from the ocean. This morning I drove past a cell tower on I-40. It's one of those tall monopole towers with the antennas at the top. I've driven past it 1,000 times. But today I noticed something I'd never noticed before. The antennas were pointed east. All of them. They're supposed to be pointed in different directions to cover different sectors. That's how cell coverage works. But every antenna on that tower was oriented the same direction, east, toward the coast. I kept driving. I passed another tower 3 miles later. Same thing. All antennas east. I passed 4 more before I got to work, every single one. I haven't checked the vibration meter in my apartment again. I already know what it would say. I already know the number would be higher. Morrison told me the approach cycles were getting closer each time. She didn't tell me what happens when they stop being cycles and become continuous. She didn't tell me what happens when whatever is out there in the deep water doesn't go back. I've been thinking about that a lot, about cycles, about how everything in nature works on cycles, tides, seasons, migrations. Animals approach and retreat. They test the boundary and pull back. They test it again, closer, pull back, closer. Until one time, the final time, they don't pull back at all. That last approach isn't an approach anymore. It's an arrival. But I think the turbines knew. I think that's why the blades on the outer banks were still spinning when I checked the telemetry the morning after. They hadn't stopped. They hadn't locked in place. Morrison said when the blades stop, it means the source is no longer offshore. The blades were still spinning. It was still out there. But on my drive home tonight, I passed the wind farm on the ridge outside Raleigh. The inland one. Small, maybe 20 turbines, built for a local utility. I've driven past it every day for weeks. The turbines are always moving, always chasing whatever direction the Piedmont wind is blowing. Tonight was breezy. I could see it. The trees along I-40 were swaying. The tall grass in the median was bent over. A plastic bag was tumbling across the highway. An American flag outside a car dealership was stretched taut and snapping. There was plenty of wind. Every nacelle on that ridge was pointed east, and the blades weren't moving.